Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is Cisco CCNA for exam 200-301. And in this episode, we're going to talk about servers and endpoints and our networking components. And here he is, Mr. Ronnie Wong. How's it going?
It's going well, Vaughn. Thank you again for joining me as we continue on and we take a look at now the idea of servers and endpoints. So this is a fairly light topic for us because most of us are actually used to dealing with these, but it is called out on the exam, so we want to understand the roles and functions as we actually get started here so that we have a clear view of all the exam objectives as we do this. So Vaughn, what we want to do, of course, is actually jump in and make sure that we can distinguish them, first of all, and then talk about what their specific roles are and, of course, how they also function. So Vaughn, does that sound like fun?
Sounds like a party.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Sounds like an amazing party. I'd love to be there every single hour of the day. But no, Vaughn, as we begin, and we want to make sure that we do understand this. And Vaughn, the reason why I wanted to kind of make sure we could distinguish this idea is that when I first began working with computers, not just individual, home computers, right? I didn't really understand the idea that a server of what it really was, okay? So Vaughn, to me, a server was exactly what people pointed out, which were these kind of larger, beefier machines, right? The ones that were higher performance that ended up, working as far as just another PC goes, but really on a larger scale, okay? Had more RAM, had more processing power, had more storage, had maybe even the idea of the NIC in it, of course, gave you more bandwidth to be able to connect into devices, okay? So Vaughn, I always considered that term server as being hardware, just like the idea of a regular PC as just being a PC. The very fact of workstations and things like that. So Vaughn, let's make sure that we actually can differentiate these things as we go through, okay? So Vaughn, when we start talking about the idea here, okay, of what a PC is, or the idea of a workstation of some sort, right, where a user is actually sitting down with it on a daily basis here, that is what we also in the Cisco realm, we call an endpoint, okay? An endpoint, as far as its role goes, okay, is essentially going to be some type of workstation or wireless device that we have. So Vaughn, if you're working on a laptop and you're connecting in wirelessly, that would be considered an endpoint. If you're sitting in a cubicle where you have a computer that's there, that is an endpoint of what it actually does, okay? So that's an example. You're on a smartphone, you're on an endpoint, okay? So when we talk about that in terms of its functionality and what it actually does here, okay? So Vaughn, this is kind of the key. The idea of an endpoint is going to be either the source or the destination of data, okay, that when we start talking about. So what do I mean by that? Vaughn, if I want to connect out to Google, okay, well, what am I actually doing? I'm actually connecting out to Google and actually saying, hey, I need to connect to Google, right? I use DNS, so I go open up a browser, I type in google.com, and when I do so, I actually get to Google, and I'm also then receiving that back. So Vaughn, I was in this instance here, the source of what I wanted to connect to, and then also the destination of the data coming back, which was essentially its web page.
And I always would think of it as maybe your data entry. Like your job is to input data into the system. You are the source of putting in that data.
Yep, that's a great example as well. So the very fact is there's a lot of different examples when we start talking about the idea of regular endpoints to what we actually do. Now, Vaughn, when we do that, most people, again, will think about that idea of this a physical computer. So normally we, of course, include then things like printers if we want to. So that's a possibility as well. Usually that's going to be the destination of data and what it outputs, of course. And so, but for us here, let's just think about it like that, okay, too.
Well, I know that in a lot of places I've worked, there's always phones, like an actual phone with a connection, and they were all connected. They were Cisco phones.
Right.
And so they're connected to the internet and everything, and that's where we got our telephone receiver. So that would be considered an endpoint as well,
That would
correct?
be considered an endpoint too. So Vaughn, the important thing about both of those that we talked about, right? Let's use your example because yours is better than mine, okay? So we'll use Vaughn's examples here. The very fact of data entry, okay? The key component in terms of the data entry right there, okay? And also the phone that Vaughn was talking about using is, well, really the human component behind this, okay? It's So Vaughn, what I mean by that is that a regular type of endpoint normally is going to be where a user has this direct interface into the network, okay? And so that means that I'm the one that's actually providing the data entry, okay? So I'm actually the one that's actually having to do that. So we're manually entering that in. It requires human interaction to make it work. The phone, if Vaughn wanted to call me up on that phone, she'd pick up the handle and then she'd dial my phone number, and then that would actually, call me as well, or she'd push whatever, if she had a memory set for something, right, on speed dial, then that would actually work as well. Okay?
You would be number one on
I would
my
be
speed
number
dial,
one.
Ronnie.
Yes, yes, I would.
I would not let anybody
Yeah.
take that space from you.
Oh, Vaughn.
Aw.
Wow. She's buttering me up for something. I don't know what it is, but
It's a Seinfeld
there we go.
episode.
Yeah. That's right. So overall, okay, you got to kind of remember that that's really when we start talking about the endpoint, it really is that, okay? So human interaction normally is going to be required, and then either the source or the destination of the data itself, okay? So Vaughn, let's take a look at an example of that right here on my screen. Now, I've opened up our Practice Labs environment to help us out. And remember, if you're an IT Pro TV subscriber, this is part of the actual premium subscription that you have access to, is to be able to get into the Practice Labs here. And we have a single lab machine. Let me see, do I have my diagram pulled up? Okay, so this is actually what it takes a look at. So Vaughn, here's the lab topology that I've pulled up, and I'm on this machine down here, where it's actually the lab machine, the P-Lab Cisco 01 machine. And notice, Vaughn, it looks like a workstation, right? We have the monitor, we have the keyboard, we have the actual little tower over here. And that means that I can interact with that particular machine right there to be able to do something. So if I do something like this, and I connect it, I've just opened up the command prompt. Ooh, it's floating around a little bit more on me than I expected it to. Get all the way back up here to the top. So let me just ping an interface that I know, which is going to be the router that's on my network. So Vaughn, here it is. I was a source. I issued the ping, and now those responses coming back, it's sending it all the way back to me. I am the destination, but it did require my interaction to be able to do what I wanted it to do. So that itself is set up to make sure that we can actually do that as well. So Vaughn, now that we have that understanding, let's contrast that to the idea of the server. So Vaughn, I tried to make sure that we understand something, that even though we can call the idea of hardware that we might purchase from a hardware vendor a server, okay, that is not really the component nature of the server and what it does. Server actually has a different role.
I always think of servers just like at a restaurant. Their role is to serve others.
Right.
So if I am a server, I'm going to serve the diners, and there's multiple diners within the restaurant, and that is my job.
Right.
And so I serve up information to or food. I guess we're talking about information.
Yeah.
So we're still kind of using that analogy.
Yeah, no, that works.
And that's how I always explain it to people.
Right. So Vaughn, your analogy is actually perfectly good one here. The very fact is a server, just like somebody, if you're sitting down at a restaurant, to be able, of course, to serve you some type of food or something, right? So for us, an example of that, Vaughn, can you name a possible example of a network server?
Well, like a file server.
Right.
And it's kind of like as a patron or a diner, right? I can, hey, it's not very nice to do that, by the way, but you call it, you wave them over, like, I need a drink. Or
Right.
so you're calling the file server. You have to know where the file server is and wave at it and say, hey, I want you to give me this information.
Right. Yeah, so that's exactly right. So Vaughn, at that point, you're doing that. Do you know of another possible server that you might think of?
Web servers. You were talking about going out
Exactly.
to Google. Well, then we have to have something that knows where all that goes, or for our intranet, our internal websites, if you
Right.
want to say, we need to have a web server.
Yep. So that allows us to serve up web pages. And Vaughn, can you think of one more, which I think is ubiquitous across just about every business network?
Well, I'm pretty sure you're going to need to send some electronic mail.
Yeah.
Email servers.
Right, an email server. So Vaughn, those are three good normal servers that we tend to find on our networks, along with other things that actually provide other services to the networking itself. So if you hear DNS or DHCP, those are network services that we tend to find regularly inside of our network, along with the email server, the web server, the file servers that Vaughn talked about as well. Now, in all those, Vaughn, okay, well, if I start thinking about that in terms of hardware, so Vaughn, I have an email server, I have a web server, I have a file server, I have DNS, I have DHCP. Vaughn, I'm talking about five different physical servers at that point. At least in my mind, that's what I think about is actually being physical machines. But Vaughn, would you be surprised if I told you that I can actually run all five of those servers on one machine? Now, I'm not saying you should do so, but I could run all five of those servers on one physical machine.
You can.
Yeah.
I've been through enough of these shows
Yeah.
to know that yes, you can do that, but you definitely want to separate everything out for redundancy and security and all those other things.
Yeah, and it's about load balancing as well. The very
Yes.
fact is not everything needs to go together on one. But yes, I can actually run them all on the same physical server if I want to. So Vaughn, my breakdown of this is actually because of my experience with it. The very fact is when I think of servers, I think of the ones that go into the racks, the physical machine itself. But when it comes down to it in reality, Vaughn, it's not about that. It's about the role that you talked about. The very fact is like a waiter, that these different types of servers that we mentioned are actually roles, but those roles are actually handled by software, okay? Now, Vaughn, what makes that software different from what we talked about as endpoints? That's where we want to go so that we have a clear understanding. So, Vaughn, do you have an idea?
Well, I do know about like the operating system. You have your end user, like a Windows 10 is an operating system for an end user, but you also have server-side applications and server-side OS,
Right.
your operating system that goes ahead and runs all that together. And then you have to connect them all together with your network and just know where everybody lives, and then how they all talk to each other.
Yeah. Now, Vaughn said the key component here, which is, remember how she described the workstation, right? Is that we are interacting with it. This time, though, Vaughn said, oh, it's the server itself that interacts and does that. And Vaughn, that's the key point when it comes down to a server. A server, for us, is actually something that we turn on, usually it's software that we turn on. We might configure it one time humanly, right, to tell it to do what we need to do. So, for example, the idea of DHCP servers, right? So dynamic host configuration protocol servers. I might configure the parameters, what the default gateway is, what the DNS servers are, what the actual pool of addresses that it's actually going to work on in my network, okay? But once I do that, Vaughn, I don't have to manage it anymore, okay? And what that means is that the server itself requires no human interaction for it to make its functionality, okay? So once I turn that server on, it says, I am going to work. I don't need anybody to tell me how to do my job. I will do it the way that I was programmed to do it. As long as I am on and I am functioning, I will continue to do my job. So Vaughn, that means when somebody actually, or when another machine requests an IP address, I don't have to go and go, oh, let me assign this one over to that machine. The DHCP server will do that for us without human interaction. When we do some type of name lookup as far as DNS goes, I don't have to go in there and go, oh, this matches up to this IP address. itpro.tv matches up to this particular IP address. The server handles it. And Vaughn, the advantage of that, okay, is that it handles it consistently, okay? Secondly, though, it handles it at computer speed, okay? So that means the interaction, it can handle a lot more than what I can do, making decisions one at a time, okay? So that means it can handle many more requests than what I can actually do at one particular point in time. It can do many of them at the same time as they come in, as they do that, and handles it at computer speed. So in its functionality, and the big differences then between endpoints and between servers, endpoints, human interaction, okay? But usually on a physical server, okay? But then, or on a physical machine, excuse me. But then servers, we can run them all on one physical machine if we choose to, but at the same time, for us, it doesn't require any human interaction. So let's show you a demonstration of what we're talking about. So Vaughn, here it is. Let's go back to my machine. Now, even though I've used this just as a very simple example of an endpoint at this right now, I can also turn this into a server very quickly. And that's because there's a piece of software on here that is called TFTP D32, okay? So this is a nice tiny little utility for us, but it is kind of intensive. It does kind of run the CPU up a little bit because it's actually written at a different period of time than what most modern machines are doing. It will eat up a lot of CPU, okay? Now, Vaughn, I'm going to actually turn on the idea of this TFTP server here, okay, is what I'm going to do. And Vaughn, when I say that, it's already done, okay? So in other words, once I actually kind of launched it up here, I selected this tab, it is done, it is up, and it is going. So Vaughn, now that I've actually got that up and going, I want to pay attention to that current directory of where we are. And so that we can see this. I'm going to go over to NY Edge 1. And on NY Edge 1, let me zoom in so that we can see this as well. I'm just going to ping and make sure that my machine can see the machine that the server is running on. Okay, so I get pings. It's successfully turning. Okay, so I'm doing that. Let me get into the privilege mode. Once I get into privilege mode, I can now go into, say, copy. I'm going to say flash TFTP. So I'm telling it to copy something from Flash into that TFTP server. When I press enter there, it's going to ask me for the source name. Now this is where I actually have to kind of get out of that for a moment because I forgot. I need to do a show Flash so I can actually find the actual name here. So Vaughn, what I want to do is I want to copy this one right here. Okay. Now I'm going to have to type it in. So that's actually the key here. I'm going to hit my up arrow. And now I have to type in, and it has to be exact C2900-universal K9-MZ.SPA.152-4.M6 M6.bin. So as long as that actually matches up, and I got to make sure because if not, it's not going to work. Universal K9MZ. That looks right, Vaughn, as far as I can tell.
Probably could have picked a smaller file name.
Yeah, nah, yeah, that's just the way it is. Now it says, hey, where am I actually sending this to? So there's the actual place that it's going to. From this point, it's saying, hey, what do you want the file name to be? It's perfectly fine. I'll leave it. And now I can see something has actually started on this server, on this router. So if I go back down to my PLAB machine, Vaughn, I can see it right there. It is now beginning to transfer the file, and I didn't have to do anything on the server end, Vaughn, right? The only thing I did is I opened up the actual product, okay? So it is now working as the actual server. And in the end result here, when it's done, because it's going to take a little bit of time because it's a relatively big image. I say that it's a little bit over 100 kilobytes overall, I think, or 100 megabytes maybe. Sorry, 100 megabytes. I was trying to remember the actual sizes here.
Like, that doesn't sound that big.
It's
Ronnie.
not really big by comparison of today's files, right? So it's a little bit over 100 megabytes if I'm actually remembering correctly. So when we start seeing something like this, it will actually do its transfer, and in the end, it will actually transfer over and do that. But Vaughn, noticed that the server didn't require anything of me. But me now, that means that when I went over to the router, that now became kind of the endpoint, right? It required my human interaction to be able to do what we needed to do, okay? So Vaughn, that's an example of the idea of a server that's running, okay? Now, on top of that, right, on this server, on this particular machine, I can also see that DNS is also a server that's running in the background, and there's other ones that are also available right here too. But for us, that's at least showing us the progress and what it's actually doing. It's almost halfway there. So this is at 56, 58 megabytes so far, so it's about 60% done. But Vaughn, that's the actual key to understanding what it is that we're doing. So what we just wanted to make sure that we understood here, right, is that idea that we could distinguish the difference between those two. And inside of a network, right, the very fact is we require both of them to actually make sure that our network functions as well, okay? So all this is actually good information for us when we start talking about components. So Vaughn, throughout this little mini series in terms of networking components, right, we've talked about, of course, routers and switches, okay? We've also, of course, talked about the idea of wireless connections. We've also gone into the Cisco DNA Center, okay? We've talked about the servers and endpoints, which I couldn't remember right off the bat. So there's a lot of different components that we've actually talked about right here, but it's a good start for us to at least know that and understand that. On the exam, make sure you focus in on the roles and the functions of each of these particular components because you're likely to see them again, especially on the exam. Doesn't mean that you'll get pegged on every single one of them, but at the same time, it doesn't hurt for you to have a basic understanding of them. The diagram that I've shown you throughout the entire little mini series here, those will also be included in the show notes for IT Pro TV subscribers as well. So we have that access available to you. And then any of the ones that you can have free access to, I again have also put those in the show notes as well. So if you can actually use it, you definitely can do the same things that I've done and probably even go a little bit more in depth. But Vaughn, that should be a good overview for us, as well as actually being able to understand the different networking components that we're expected to know for this exam.
All right. Always great information from you, Ronnie, and always be nice to your servers. They're people too, or even your computer servers.
Right.
Be nice to them. They have a lot of work to do. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us, but we're going to go ahead and sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
Now I'm Ronnie Wong.
We will see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.